get started, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to our History at Noon program, running through the summer months. I will tell you right now that next week we have duck and decoy carver Tom Eckert. The week after that is myself doing a photo gallery on things that you can do on the frozen St. Lawrence River. What I'm trying to do is encourage you not to leave the area at the end of summer, all right? Because there's a lot of fun activities that happen. But today, we're going to learn a little bit about Prohibition, all right? And I'm going to be listening just as much as everyone else, all right?
Who's got a phone on them?
You want
Make sure that nobody Googles me, and by the time we're done, you'll think I'm an historian, okay? So, does anyone not know me? Couple. Okay, so my name is Jeff Garnsey, and according to the books back on the shelf, my family settled here. When I say here, I mean Grindstone Island in 1813. So we traced back 7 generations here and then 13 back to Massachusetts. So we've been here since the ocean was freshwater and Moby Dick was a minnow. And part of that was our proximity to the border. My little chunk of family lived on the head of Grindstone Island, Thurso Bay, Buck Bay, Watch, Whiskey, Papoose, Club was all in that 600-acre farm that was split up by my great 6 times passed among his three sons. So how I got roped into this is guilt by association. I was never a smuggler. As far as alcohol goes on the river, but I was raised on the river. I was obviously a deckhand from very early on from my grandfather, and my grandfather couldn't make the same claim. His name was Rolly Garnsey, and his baby brother Dan and he became 2 of the most, I don't want to say most well-known, but certainly the most notorious of the bootleggers, because they were also fishermen. And I don't know if anyone has ever been exposed to fishermen, but occasionally they like to tell stories. And normally there's a bit of truth in each of those stories. And what ended up happening with my grandfather and my uncle is they ended up getting caught because they were telling stories. And what that leaves is a trail of newspaper articles that can quantify whether they were or were not, in fact, smugglers. So in order to really dive into Prohibition locally, we have to kind of go globally, because you've got to understand that there's no way, given any one of these single events, that Prohibition ever would have happened. It absolutely was impossible. But the perfect storm of events happened, and they didn't happen in 1920 when Prohibition took off. They started back in the mid-1800s when the Women's Suffrage Act started to take hold. You know, there was 1 or 2 women that wanted out of the kitchen. So they started, that was it? That was the only, you guys are going to be so easy. So the women's suffrage movement believed that the disintegration of the family unit had a lot to do with alcohol. There was more violence, there was more family separation, there was more abandonment issues, etc., etc., etc. Now, they didn't really take hold nationally for a while, but up in Maine in 1846, Maine actually was the first state to establish a statewide prohibition. Oh. So the rumblings were there very early on, and by 1917, 26 states of the 48 that we had then had established statewide prohibitions. So the writing was on the wall, but now at that level, nationally, there was no federal law prohibiting the sale, manufacture, distribution of alcohol. But who knows one of the events that happened in 1917 that set off this wheel of events? Anybody?
War?
Boom! World War I. So what business or group of organizations accounted for about 20% of the employment in the United States?
Liquor manufacturers or beer?
Liquor and beer manufacturers. Now, who accounted for about 80% of the ownership of liquor and beer manufacturing?
German.
Boom! You see, you guys have done your homework.
What they say?
German.
That's what my
Yes,
guess
so
would be.
we had avoided World War I for 3 years. And then when submarine warfare started to affect transit lines, they were sinking ships that were in neutral country flagged. And everybody knows, the stories of the cruise ships that were sunk. So the United States was kind of pushed into World War I. And as a result, there was a league that was just under the surface that an awful lot of people in the political hierarchy were not so loosely attached to, and that was the Anti-Saloon League. The Anti-Saloon League became the only public group of people who not only successfully lobbied the U.S. Congress, but pushed the legislation through to change the United States Constitution. They're the ones that pushed through the 18th Amendment. Now here's where the American public and a great deal of politicians, I bet that's not going to show up on the recorder, just keep going. A great deal of the politicians kind of got sold a bill of goods that they didn't really think they were going to be sold. So we get into World War I and we couldn't just say, well, we don't like German people because, Generation X was on their way. So what we had to do instead was create this war effort that diverted all of our natural resources into the successful completion and then getting out of World War I. And what that meant was we had to limit the amount of beer that was produced. And how do you do that? You limit the amount of wheat, barley, grain, etc. that is allowed to be used by one single business entity. So by doing that, they knocked the production of beer greater than in half. And the Prohibition hadn't even started yet, but the writing was on the wall. So now the legislation was introduced by the Anti-Saloon League, and they had a great deal to do with how it was fed to everybody up on the Hill, Senate and Congress. And when the 18th Amendment passed, it did not define the words alcohol or intoxicating beverages. There was no definition of it. So they also didn't define how it was going to be policed, because local authorities were on the state level. There was no federal agency that was going to police this ban all of a sudden on alcoholic beverages. So why is the 18th Amendment referred to as the Volstead Act? Anybody?
Oh, I forgot.
I'll tell you. That's why I'm here, to answer those questions. So the head of the Judicial Committee in Congress, which was the entity that wrote all the little bills that wrote along anything that might have been amended in the Constitution, was also the head of the Anti-Saloon League.
Oh.
And the president of that league wrote in his own penmanship a letter defining how how Prohibition was going to be not only enacted, but how it was going to be policed. And he gave that to the representative from Wisconsin, whose name was Andrew Volstead.
Yeah.
So it was spoon-fed to him. Now, somewhere in that fine print that nobody really paid attention to, he also defined intoxicating beverages. His definition is what changed the face of the United States from that point on for the next 22 years until the 21st Amendment was signed. And Hoover saw the writing on the wall because he was a detail guy. And he saw the definition of intoxicating beverages being defined as any beverage that is 0.5% alcohol by volume. Now, I've had some weak beer in the years. 3.2 is about the weakest that I could stomach. Now, at the very same time, and this is one of those kind of in the parentheses off to the side pieces of information, Canada was enacting a prohibition at the same time. And they, unlike us, didn't drink the same Kool-Aid. They said that alcohol was defined as any liquid having greater than 2.5% by volume, which opened the gate for places like Molson to continue to brew a lesser intoxicating beverage. It just really kind of stonewalled the Canadian clubs of the world. So Canada enacted their prohibition at the same time, and it was signed 3 years before it actually was put under enforcement. And how it was put under enforcement was they brought on a new bureau, the Bureau of Prohibition. So, and of course later on it became the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, which is a much sexier name than just Prohibition. But they had 3,000 employees that were tasked with policing not only the interior of the United States, north, south, east, and west, but more importantly, the border areas. And this is where we kind of sat on the sidelines for the beginning, because Detroit was the nucleus of where all the alcohol was coming across. And we just kind of sat quietly here because we were a tourist town. You could still cross the border, you could go on a tour boat, and you could drink beer across the border and come back hammered, and even carry the occasional clinker inside your wife's dress, which was not uncommon at all. So while this was happening, Detroit and Chicago, it was just a financial boom. So a few other things started to rumble. Immediately, they started to feel the effects of that loss of $11 billion in taxes that had happened as one of those unintended consequences. So people at the local level didn't necessarily support these 3,000 people that worked for, they called them revenuers, that was the nickname. So they started relying heavily on the magistrate. And this is where we'll pull into our border a little bit closer. During the period of Prohibition in the state of New York, how many arrests do you think that there were? Just a guess. Nope, way off.
Not very many.
There were 7,000 arrests
Really?
in the state of New York. Now, who wants to guess how many convictions of those 7,000?
0.
It's a real number. 17 people were convicted of the 7,000 arrests. Now, our local rock stars, we didn't have the Elliot Ness. You know, he was off in Chicago trying to get Al Capone. We didn't have a lot of the syndicated criminals that you see in the Detroit area and the Chicago area. But we had some pretty famous law enforcement. Izzy Einstein was a huge one. Bo Smith was another one. And these folks actually came locally to not only Cape Vincent, but Alexander Bay and Clayton. And they bumped up against a lot of the local magistrate. And of the 7,000 arrests made in the state of New York, 5,000 of them they accounted for. So it was a big deal. So how tourist areas like Clayton and Alexander Bay, not quite as much up in Cape Vincent, how they responded to that was telephone. You could either telephone or you could telegraph, and anytime they came into Jefferson County as close as Watertown, the line started ringing. And these two were apparently masters of disguise. They would show up in ladies' garments. They would show up like, you know, with the big blossomy hat. They would show up with fake beards and mustaches, and they would find their way into these speakeasies. Now, speaking of speakeasies, in the first 3 years of Prohibition, who wants to guess how many speakeasies opened up when all the bars went away? Not a guess in the entire room.
We were too young.
Yeah. They say upwards of 300,000 speakeasies in the United States.
Wow.
Now, if you think about how many bars there are, that's just about as many as we have in Cape Vincent and Alexander Bay. So it's spread over the entire country. So the pull was toward organized crime. And so another unintended consequence of the Prohibition was We've already lost that $11 billion. Now this is when $11 billion was a lot of money. And in order to enforce the Volstead Act, we spent $300 million. And again, that was a lot of money if you think about what was going on, because what was just about to happen the very next year. Any guesses?
The war?
World War I, we're already in there.
Okay.
17. What happened in 18?
Pandemic.
Not 2018. 1918.
Spanish.
No. The Great Depression started as a result of the crash on Wall Street. So now you've got 20% of the workforce that had already been kicked to the curb because Anheuser-Busch happened to be of the wrong nationality. And now the people that were looking down on the lowly people that were in tent cities all started jumping from buildings because the stock market crashed. The only people that were controlling the wealth were the people that were controlling the flow of alcohol in and out of the country. And down south, where NASCAR was born, why do you suppose that? That's not a coincidence. They didn't have a border to draw alcohol across. So, although the rate of liver infection and diseases like cirrhosis of the liver dropped by about 70%, it was completely negated by the fact that the number of people that were dying of either alcohol poison or going blind from ill-begotten alcohol quadrupled. The number went up. So, it depends on whether you're on one side of the street or the other, and much of this area was split. It was a very right or wrong. There were very few people that thought that the prohibition on alcohol was a gray area that they didn't need to vote on. There were those that were like, well, these people are making money when there are people living, in the woods because they lost their homes. And then there were the people that were risking their lives on ice skates with 2 cases of beers and coming across from Gananoque, and delivering them for a penny a piece. So it depended on which side your family was on, especially when the Depression started. So how this kind of wrapped locally for us is it wasn't ever the big money, but it was a bunch of really, really sharp river rats before river rats were really popular. Because if you figure there's about 1,800 islands out there and every one of them has on average about 25 shoals, there are lots of opportunities for somebody that's not familiar with the area and doesn't have a GPS, which I don't think Thousand Island skiffs were even equipped with them back in the day. It was pretty easy to make not a substantial amount of money, but at least enough to stay afloat during the Great Depression by smuggling to local folks. And how you did that was you smuggled to the folks that were in the highest position in the community. Now, something else, just to back up just a little bit, another way to get a hold of the alcohol was either look to the church or look to your doctor, because another loophole was alcohol could be written in script form for medicinal I'm going to spit that out. Medicinal purposes. Now, has anybody ever got home and thought, man, I could really use a drink after that day? Well, let your doctor write you a script. So it was interpreted extremely loosely, the amount of prescriptions that any one doctor could write. And so there was a stockpile in the United States of alcohol that had been set aside for medicinal uses. Now, where else can you get alcohol every Sunday?
Church.
Exactly. So Sacramento.
Some churches.
Some church, yes. Not Tom's.
Not
But
mine.
some of them, the amount of the amount of wine used as a sacrament in the church skyrocketed. And coincidentally, although the amount that was used skyrocketed, the population of the Sunday sermon does not seem to have been affected one way or another. So you can draw your own conclusions. But the alcohol continued to flow, and after just a very few years, Canada stopped drinking the Kool-Aid, and they said, you know what, this is insane, because we're cutting off our face to spite our nose, cutting off our nose to spite our face, because that's a huge source of revenue. And you could get little tickets, and you could actually have a permit to transfer alcohol. Well, if you can write it up, somebody can duplicate that. So very, very often, the folks that brought it to the Canadian border had legal authority to bring it anywhere in the province of Ontario. And of course, it was very similar across from Detroit and across from Chicago. So getting it to the border was the big buddy. So because we didn't have just one large group of people that were bringing in or wanting the alcohol, it was tourism as a whole, and it was all pretty regional because remember, natural resources had been kind of pushed back a little bit. So the New York and Philadelphia Railway that dead-ended right here in Clayton would put you on the coal docks, and you can hop on a ship and you can go to one of the 6 hotels here, and at the hotel you'd ask the concierge, you know, I've heard that Canadian whiskey is really good. And so it was a constant rush of alcohol to all the hotels. And it wasn't just by boat, it came in by bus. Buses started carrying larger and larger amounts of milk to market in these big metal containers. People were really, really smart about the way they did it. And this is where we get into the local lore. Because I retired in 2009, and in 1988, anyone ever heard of the name Dr. Laura Rush?
Yeah.
Yes, so anthropologist, very, very sharp young lady, but she really didn't read the crowd that she was talking to when she did about 10 years of research and then talked the Antique Boat Museum, which of course was the Shipyard Museum, into putting up this exhibit that everybody was going to love because it talked not so loosely about specifics during the Prohibition that had happened locally. And everybody loves local history, except for the people that had those wet businesses that had stopped talking about it years ago. So that exhibit started at the Shipyard Museum in 1988, and it did not even make it all the way through the summer before it folded in on itself. And one of the guys that had done the talking, and again, I would love to say that it was rumor, except that it was written about pretty substantially at the time, was Dan Garnsey. Dan sat down with Laura and dished on all the local families in the area. And of course, he was talking about himself too, and you know, fisherman, surprise, surprise, he may have embellished just a little bit. So when I retired, all of this was accessible in the archives of the Antique Boat Museum. And since I was by then teaching captain school and doing volunteer programs for the museum, I had access to their archives with gloves on and having somebody breathing directly over my neck. I sat and I read those 5 cases of archived material that Dr. Laura Rush had left, including the book that had the Strauss arrests in it, because we had a local magistrate here that was relatively proficient at writing tickets and arresting people, but again, no convictions. During the course of Prohibition, there were no convictions that stood. One arrest that happened was where everybody knows where the Ringer Gallery is, that Kenny Pharmacy was before then. There was a small market. Well, my grandfather was in there, and the magistrate happened to be in there at the same time, and he leaned over across the counter and said, "Hey, I'm bringing some beer over from Canada tonight. Guess where?" And then just walked out. Well, he had just about all of the lip that he could handle from my grandfather. So he brought in 17 members of law enforcement, and they covered each of the ports in Clayton. And anybody know where Dan's Cottages used to be?
Yeah.
Just before you go onto the French Creek Bridge on the right, my Uncle Dan's place. So they were coming in, my uncle and my grandfather, and there was the revenuers and the magistrate standing on the dock. Well, Uncle Dan jumps off the boat full of beer, and like a little muskrat hides in the crib of the dock, so he wasn't apprehended. My grandfather thought he was a little faster than the fastest guy there and started to run through the woods, and he got about from here to the office back there, and he caught up on a tree stump, not a stump, but the root that was exposed, and he tripped, and he got a big gash on his shin, and he got cuffs on his hands. And they took him in front of the magistrate, and he was convicted of violations of the Volstead Act. And they had him lined up to do 17 years. That's what the maximum sentence was. Now, somewhere between conviction and his sentencing, that 17 years turned to 17 months. And the 17 months of incarceration turned into 17 months of probation. So he never did a day in jail after having been the bane of the magistrate's existence for about 3 years. They used to refer to them as those rotten little Garnsey boys from Grindstone. And there was a group that were in this same pool, but they were all local and they were all pretty sharp. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of the unfortunate barn in Fisher's Landing that burned 4 times in a month. The same barn caught fire on the same day of the week, in the middle of the night, 4 times. Now, you gotta scratch your head and think, now, how does a barn burn down 4 times? And how is there enough there to burn down? Then you have to pull the string of what was happening in Clayton while there was a fire in Fisher's Landing. What was happening in Clayton was there were several boats coming into Clayton, and there were several pickup trucks with canvas over the back of them waiting to load up, because where would be more convenient to load and discard a cargo than the town docks in Clayton? But how are you going to keep law enforcement away? You're going to set a barn in Fisher's Landing on fire, and all the volunteer firemen and all the local police head to Fisher's Landing and scratch their head because the barn is fully engulfed, but there's nothing in the barn. Because every time it burns down, within a couple of days they reframe that thing and get ready for the next delivery, and then light it again. And that was again in the archives at the Antique Boat Museum. And some things are just so much more funny than fiction when they actually happen. And several of the communities, the small towns in this area, because of safety concerns, actually forbid their local law enforcement from pursuing and or discharging a weapon at anyone that was in violation or thought to be in violation of the Volstead Act. So if you went speeding from Depauville to Clayton with a load of alcohol, or vice versa, say you're headed out of the North Country, local law enforcement did not have the authority based on local jurisdiction to pursue you unless you were breaking another law. And speeding apparently wasn't important enough to warrant a high-speed pursuit. So it had to be one of those, remember, those 3,000 people, right? So what do you think was the lowest paid federal employee positionally in the United States at that time?
Revenue agent?
There were 3,000 of them, and they were paid not even on par with your local postman. And they were in harm's way all the time, or could be in harm's way. So what do you think the percentage of that 3,000 people that found a way to get alternate forms of income? So if you look at the number of arrests and the number of convictions, Lucky Marcone, hold on. Yes. Yeah, that's why I have my notebook. But of course I don't have my reading glasses on, so I can't see anything. But he was actually arrested 25 times in a 5-year period in New York State. And how many times was he convicted? None. And we're not talking about, just taking a little bit of booze from Gananoque to Grindstone to Clayton. We're talking about significant crimes here inside the city. But at the time that the 21st Amendment was up to be signed, it was believed that 70% of all persons in positions of authority in government in Chicago were actually on the payroll of, in Chicago, Alphonse Capone, right? In New York, it had gotten so rampant that there was rumor that in DC, there was a guy, they referred to him as the man in the green hat, and he operated a speakeasy in one of the Senate main office buildings. Openly, they called him the man in the green hat. And so it became such a joke that it was a political tool. They'd already seen that it failed, right? Because the things that they had gained, they eventually had lost. Like it's documented that in the first 12 years of Prohibition, the rate of alcoholism and consumption dropped about 70%. So prior to that, it was at about 2 gallons a year. Currently, and at least as far as Wikipedia goes, the average consumption for legal drinking age American is 3.3 gallons over the course of a year, which isn't really an awful lot if you've ever been to Potter's Beach on a Saturday. So there was no real gain there. And now down south you had all these people making bathtub alcohol, and you had the use of ethyl alcohol, which was blinding people because they could get a hold of it, and some people just had to have it. So that brings us to the next thing that happened that was unintended. If you put straw out in your field and take your cow over to it and you leave him there all day long, he's not going to eat any of that straw at all. It's just going to stand there. He'll eat all the way around it. But put a fence around that straw. They'll knock the fence down and they'll eat every single bit of that straw. That's just human nature and cow nature. So human nature says if I don't want it, I'm not going to get it. But if somebody tells me I can't have it, that's the first thing that I think of. So the rate of alcoholism over the course between 20 and 33, the course of Prohibition, it went down and then it rebounded. And then it exceeded the original rate of alcoholism, because if you're hiding it, you're more prone to take it. That's what, and they document that with religions around the world. Religions that say there can't be any consumption of alcohol have on par with the highest rate of alcoholism across the board, because you say you can't have it, and of course you're going to want it. If I tell you can't have that Coke, you're going to suck the bottom right out of that Coke. I know it. So we became kind of our worst enemies, and of course FDR, he made the famous. Does anybody remember the famous saying that probably got FDR elected president? Not long after the stock market crashed, it was pretty obvious that there was going to be a change in the guard at the highest level, and FDR had read the tea leaves, so he went out and said publicly during Prohibition, what the United States needs right now more than anything is a good stiff drink. And he won by a promise that you elect me, and no matter how bad everything gets, you're going to be able to have a nice stiff drink. And guess what? He just absolutely won, running away in a landslide, because people were disenfranchised with the fact that there were folks walking around that had a lot of money that seemed to be above the law, and the people that were the law had a lot of money that was ill-begotten. So it was when Hoover looked back. Now, in his defense, he did try to veto the Volstead Act, and he was beat out by a super majority. So he put a veto on it, and it passed anyway. And at that point, he coined the phrase, this was the largest experiment, social and economic experiment ever failed. And it was doomed to fail right from the very beginning, because we watched it go right down the wormhole to the scene of the accident. So in a nutshell, that's kind of why we had such a really lackluster showing of criminals in the Thousand Islands area, and how throughout the prohibition on alcohol, it never really slowed the consumption or even the movement to a lesser extent of alcohol to and from the border. The same thing that people do today, they were doing then, and before the Prohibition, they were doing it too. Everybody has 15 minutes of fame, right? They say. So my grandfather tells a story about a gentleman that owned a camp down Millionaires Row that wrote a relatively famous song and sold it to another relatively famous gentleman named Bing Crosby. And Bing was rumored to be kind of a fan of Canadian whiskey. And while he was visiting Irving Berlin's camp down the river, he let it be known through the grapevine that he was a real fan of Canadian whiskey. And a young man by the name of Garnsey rode up to the camp with that case of Canadian whiskey, and Bing Crosby pulled one of those dusty bottles out and pulled the top out and gave the first shot to my grandfather, and that was his 15 minutes of fame that he actually smuggled alcohol for Bing Crosby. So, but everybody has a story about Prohibition if you're from this neck of the woods, because everybody's parent or grandparent either heard a story from their parents or grandparents, or one from, you know, family or friends or relatives. Nobody escaped the Prohibition in this neck of the woods, but, you know, at the end of the day, there wasn't a great deal of harm that was done except to that unfortunate barn down in Fisher's Landing. So at this point, if anyone has any questions, or if anyone would like to share any of their Prohibition stories, this would be a good opportunity to do it. And we
Do
have
the
a tape.
revenuers have boats?
It's a yes and no question. They were given boats that were in Detroit, and they rented boats from locals in this neck of the woods. Now, the caveat to that was they didn't rent boat masters. So what would happen very, very often is the locals were in camp boats. Now, if you look at say, for instance, a 21-foot Lapstreak Lyman was the most popular camp boat ever manufactured on the river, period. Lapstreak was lighter, it was less expensive, it could be built easily, and it was a runabout, so there was always forward and aft stowage with an athwartship's motor and lots of place to put canvases over so you could hide alcohol in it. The revenuers, on the other hand, got this oak keel mahogany plank teak deck go fast little boat that could be run right across every shoal that was between them and that little, you know, 5-knot monster. So they did have boats, but they were locally procured boats, and normally they went out just long enough to find some hard water and, you know, be passed. And everybody has a story about, you know, how many props were knocked off, how many bottoms were caved in, how many people were rescued off. I mean, the two most ferocious spots in this neck of the woods are coincidentally on two of the trade routes that were the most prolific. The cut between Murray Island and Wellesley Island, just because it's a natural fissure where it was a glacial shift, so you got 3 feet going in, 3 feet going out, 30 feet in the channel. So depth finders back then were the guy in the suit that drew the short straw that had a piece of lead in a cube and a string, and you would throw it out in front of the boat. When it came tight, you'd bring that up, and that gave you the depth. If it was going down, you knew you were in good water, headed deep. If it was going up, you knew you were headed toward expensive noises. So if you came across the head of Wellesley and managed to make it through that monster bunch, then you'd get into that little fjord, and you'd think you were going into a bay. Because if you look back at it, it's almost solid granite all the way across. It's not until you get inside of it that you realize that that's a gateway to Eel Bay and immediately into a whole bunch of islands you can hide in and get into the Canadian mainland. So that was one area where there's a really, really rough patch of shoals. The other, of course, is on the head of Grindstone. If you try to stay too far away from Gull Shoals, you get nicked on the head of Club by all those shoals that are on the head of Grindstone Island. And if you go too far out from Whiskey Island, there's another one waiting for you out there. And if you knew enough to use ranges, which is how people got around back then, you could open on one set, close on the other set, and you could have put a boat directly in your wake on a shoal without even getting a nick in your prop. And that's why most of the really, I don't want to use the word successful, but definitely the most efficient transporters were people that had been caretakers on islands, and it was just another way to make a couple dollars. It wasn't somebody that wanted a Cadillac and a new house. It was somebody that wanted to feed their kids, and that was a way to do it. So was that the shortest yes you've ever heard? Any other questions or yes?
So you cited the fact that there were thousands of arrests and virtually none of them held up. Was that attributable to the judge's enjoyment of alcoholic consumption?
Often. But if you stack the deck and you pay people off in advance, or if the rule that they're trying to enforce is just so far into the face of common sense, looking the other direction, or reinterpreting something, in my grandfather's case. I mean, he was going to go to jail, but nobody locally was going to do it to him. So it ended up being kind of redefined as far as the violation of the Volstead Act. But the real fact of the matter is there was a lot of easy cash to be made out there, and the hardest working guys were the guys that were really looked upon the darkest from the local folks, because this was a federal law that had been imposed on a local area. And if you look at this area, the two states that did not recognize the 18th Amendment when it was signed and then ratified were Maryland and New York. So we were already on the other side of that whole argument about whether it was legal or not, because if tourism drives 80 cents out of every dollar, and you know that you're going to lose 75 cents because nobody can come up and have a frosty beverage, are you going to agree with it? And that's really, it was an inside job more than anything. But yeah, there was a lot of embarrassment because public officials were on the take or redefining jurisdictions. So.
Those archives that you reviewed at the Boat Museum, is there any public access to that type of information?
The best that you could hope for would be a tour through, but they're because they're original documents, and like with everything else, any piece of paper over the course of time, even without the contact from oily fingers, will deteriorate. So they're pretty protective of it, and how they deal with that at the museum is they try to cycle information in and information out. The unfortunate thing is that just for instance, where the Frontenac Hotel was, on the channel side of Round Island, started out as where the money was, because the hotel was on that side. So who knows what they called the south-facing shore of Round Island? And they still refer to it. Anybody? They call it the service side, because that's where all the services came into Round Island. And as a result of that, which was way back in 1913 when there was a big fire, property values on the south-facing shore of Round Island have never caught up to the north shore. It's exactly the same kind of a deal. You have this predisposed notion, and the feedback that the Antique Boat Museum got was that local people do not want to have their laundry out for the world to see. So that probably will never be on public display again. So unfortunately, because I fell asleep in there a dozen times because there's just so much. It's just ad nauseum. You're like, oh my God, this guy got arrested. This guy, and then you start looking at, well, who didn't get arrested? Everybody did, but who got convicted? So I guess the short answer is it's difficult, and you'd have to go into the archives and you'd have to have a specific reason. But as far as public access, I've never seen just the average guy go in and pay for museum access and get into the archives, because it's quite the vault.
Now, I've heard in some talk that the transporters would tow kegs in the water. Was that part of it, or was it usually all in the boat?
No, actually, you're kind of half right. What they would do is they would weight them down. They would have the ballast inside the boat. And the story that my grandfather told was my point of reference. On the north side of Grindstone, he was being pursued. He was in a significantly smaller boat. but he did have a few blocks, but not line of sight blocks. So he pulled in to the bay just this side of Potter's Beach. And as he did, he took the cases of Canadian whiskey that had huge sandbags filled with either salt or sugar in them, and they immediately absorb the water and they become negatively buoyant. So depending on the weight of, or the depth of the water, they would be suspended just off the bottom for a short period of time. Now, you can't have the guys that are chasing you hang around long enough to watch stuff start bobbing to the surface. So he pulled in with his little skiff into the big gray boathouse, and one of his good friends was the caretaker of that particular property, and they pulled the bailing plug of the skiff, they sunk her in place and put the workboat from the camp on top of it.
Wow.
And sure enough, here comes the revenuers. They hopped on, we're gonna get this guy, got in the boat. There's nothing but tools and canvas in this boat. Where could it have gone? So frustrated, they head back to Gananoque or wherever it is that they came from, and right in their wake, these little cases start popping up because the sugar and salt would dissolve. So it would then again be positively buoyant because the cases were generally made out of a softer wood, which has some pretty positive buoyancy. You know, even pine or hemlock, it's going to float pretty quickly and it's going to carry some weight with it. So, and there were also instances of actually, no kidding, painting one boat 2 colors because they would watch these little, I always refer to the 19 and 21 foot Lyman because that was the standard camp boat. But imagine going to Gananoque and being observed in a black lap streak. 2 hours later, they're waiting to see that black lap streak come back, except that the port side of that boat has been painted pearl white. And it comes back across with a load of alcohol, and they never see that black one until it goes back to Gan the next week. That sounds like something that you'd make up, but it wasn't. It actually happened, you know. And how do you explain a multicolored boat? Well, it's my boat. I didn't have enough money to paint the whole thing. I thought about changing the color. You know, you pick the instance, add the fisherman, and he gets away with it. So, you had.
Oh, I was just going to wonder about it, but my Prohibition story isn't about here, but it is involved.
Has the statute of limitation run out, or are they going to come
Oh,
get
I
you?
think so. My
Okay,
brother-in-law
good.
died not
Okay,
long
so
ago
you're
at
safe.
92, and his father's been gone for a long time. His father had a restaurant up in Valhalla, which I think is Westchester County, and he during Prohibition was a customer of Al Capone's little operation. And one day my brother-in-law, when he was a teenager, I don't know what he did, but he got in trouble and the police were chasing him, and he goes home. Well, his father was not happy because the Prohibition, the delivery had just occurred, and therefore they got away, and so they didn't go and search the house or this restaurant. But his father said, "Don't you ever do something like that again." That was close, apparently.
Yeah, that's close. Anybody else have any questions? Or in the
I
back.
read somewhere that they use Old Castle as like a warehouse drop.
It is
stuff.
funny that you should say that, because this little book, Chess with Violence, I read this cover to cover and I thought, holy cow, how can this possibly be true? Well, it's not, however, it's a work of nonfiction, but they reference exactly what you're talking about. And if you were to talk to the right person of the right age that had heard the right conversation, one of the stories, the one that really caught with me, was the only place on Hart Island that was actually functional was Astor Tower. And Astor Tower, in the book, was occasionally used to store contraband alcohol. Much like Cherry Island, you know, the lore was that about 20% of the contraband alcohol that made its way into Alexander Bay came across Cherry Island, thus the gargoyles with the sticking out tongue, because they never found any. Well, what happened with this particular story was that a relatively large cache of alcohol was being stored to bring over stateside by a group that had been sent from Detroit to the Thousand Islands because it was such a porous portion of the border, and they had really blocked off about 80% of that waterway going across from Detroit were these little go-fast boats that had been financed federally. So this was the next frontier for those dudes from Detroit. So rumor and fiction has it that some of the local bootleggers set the trap and met them as the supplier and brought their booze over into Astor Tower. And when they arrived to take possession of the booze, they knocked them out, tied them, gagged them, and left notes, "These are the bad guys, take us to jail," as they were tied to trees on Hart Island.
Oh,
That's the story that's in the book. Portions of that story were obviously fiction, but enough of it was actually nonfiction that the story was out there before this book ever came around. But if you're into really cool reading and you're interested in Prohibition, this is a good read. It's pretty, I mean, even I didn't fall asleep during it. And the Rum Across the Border. Does anybody remember the Rum Across the River series that played on PBS? Really, it's already gone that, well, unbelievable. If you get home and you hit your computer, you'll see that they did a PBS, they did Rum Across the River, and as filler for the different segments in that, they had 7 different episodes that were just quick little blurs, and I did 5 of the 7 of them just based on that whole proximity thing, because my grandfather had, rumor had it, had been a bit of a bootlegger. So then when it comes, there was a guy named Emmett Smith that was the curator at the Antique Boat Museum. Very smart young man, but everything had to be quantified. He would not let a word out of his mouth unless he could put pen to paper and say, this is where this statement is the truth. And as you know, I'm a fisherman, so none of that applies to me. You can hear the loud popping noises if I get lost, because I'm gonna make it up and you're never gonna know the difference, because again, fisherman. So they brought me in for that 7th segment as a, what did they call it? It was a consultant, and paid me to speak about the Antique Boat Museum's collection with regard to Prohibition and what type of boats. And I knew probably less coming out of that than I did going into it, but it really played well. And that's kind of the gift that keeps giving, because they did little segments and then they showed it on Uncle Sam's boat tour, and you can still access it online, and they're really just the same music over and over for all 7. The whole episode was like 2 hours, but my little 15 minutes of fame might have been 10 minutes total. But you would not believe the number of bootlegger tours that I've done just as a result of that little deal. So that's where my involvement with Prohibition really kind of kicked off. I just got kind of dragged feet first into it. So, and then of course, then you've got to learn what you're talking about, because once people ask you to come and talk, you at least got to hit the high points of some, because one of you guys is going to Google me as soon as we get out of here. So any other questions or?
What did they do with it once they confiscated it?
The alcohol? Normally it was dumped in a public place with multiple witnesses. That's generally, if it was Canadian whiskey in the big barrels, the way that it traveled across Detroit and Chicago, they would take pickaxes and they would knock holes in it. Boxes and boxes and boxes of broken bottles would be smashed at the Bay Dock, at the Clayton Dock, because they would inspect cargoes coming in relatively often. You had to know the frequency and the periodicity of the magistrate to the docks, and that of course was where the local side came in. If you knew what his schedule was, because you had just had coffee with him 8 o'clock in the morning, you had a pretty good idea when you could come into the town dock without being molested or losing your cargo. Was there another one in the back? Yeah.
Did they run this liquor daytime, nighttime, or anytime?
Yes. Daytime, nighttime, spring, summer, fall, winter.
Okay.
There's the famous picture of the little girl that had a case of beer and ice skates that came right around the head of Grindstone and walked ashore at Bartlett's Point, and they got pictures of her. And somehow she was miraculously never caught. But yeah, anytime that someone wanted a drink, there was somebody that was going to risk it. And that's why, you know, that back just at the latter part of Prohibition, when the 3 youngsters from Grindstone Island drowned, it's because that was the only time in that 100-year period that the St. Lawrence River had not frozen over. And they drowned bringing alcohol across. And of course, since then, since 2009, we've had 5 instances. So, but there's no such thing as climate change, so you guys are cool. Okay. Any other questions? That's it.
Jeff, you're awesome to listen to. I mean, he's done this so many times, it just flows and flows. And I was thinking back there, if I was to ever try to do what you just did, I'd go home and put my head in the ground. Now, we have 3 posters. I have 3 posters, Duck and Decoy. If you're interested, raise your hand if you can answer this question. And I wrote these down as he was talking. What state was the first state to have Prohibition?
Maine.
I saw this hand go up first. You weren't supposed to say it out loud. I wanted to see if she could get it correct. Maine? Would you like a poster? All right. The second question. All right. 7,000 people arrested. How many convicted? Everybody knows you're not raising their hand.
More posters.
The lady in yellow. Of the speakeasies, how many across the United States? How many thousand?
300,000.
300,000. All right. We have some people that were listening. I know you were all listening. All right. Thank you very much for attending History at Noon. Again, next week is Tom Eckert on duck and decoy carving. And he said you're welcome to bring your own duck and decoy. He will look at it, talk to you about it. So, but you'll hear his program. Again, thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you.
Are you doing any of the bootlegger tours?
I do them all the time.
Do them all the time.
And-
If you're interested, I know I might be.
And farm tours.
All right, farm tours. All right.
How do we find out about ththese bootlegger tours?
I own a company called Classic Island Cruises. So I have old antique boats, and I do wine and cheese cruises. I do fishing, some catching, a lot of fishing. I do traditional shore dinners. If you can do it on the river, I do it on antique boats. So I've got 5 of them, but I keep 2 commissioned every year. And then I fix what I broke last year, put those back in the water. So I'm easy to find.
I got an interesting tidbit about Jeff. You might not know. He's a Navy retiree. Spent many years in the Navy on a submarine. How many years? You had 28 years in the service?
26 years in the service.
26 years. Don't answer this. How many of those years, on average, was he actually under the sea?
Oh.
It's an ugly number.
It's an ugly.
How about 20? Aren't you there 6 months at a time?
No, actually underwater. Of the 26 years, I spent 19 years and 6 months underwater.
How do you cope with that?
You think about being back home again, and so that's why I went, so I could be here.
Thank you for your service.
Oh, thanks.
Yes. I figure when you pass away, we're going to study. We're going to decide to study your brain. All right.
Yes, they will.
Yeah, thank
Well,
you.
thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.